They say there are truths buried so deep in history that men dare not speak them aloud. Not because they are forgotten, but because the moment you hear them, something inside you changes. So listen carefully, because once you know the name Emma Richter, you can never unknow it. In the winter of 1873, Milwaukee was a city of smoke and steel, a German immigrant community building beer empires and chasing the American dream. And yet, inside a modest wooden home on Galena Street, sat an 11-year-old girl who shattered the illusion that reality is safe, stable, or explainable. Her neighbors whispered she could calculate the day of the week for any date in human history in seconds. She could memorize entire conversations word for word after hearing them once. She could walk past 2 buildings and tell you the exact number of steps separating their doors. But this was not the talent of a child. This was something other. The people of the quarter first called her a prodigy, a blessing, a miracle sent by God to elevate their community. But miracles don't make men tremble when they pass by a child's window. Miracles don't predict death with clockwork precision. And that's exactly what Emma did. She began watching her neighbors with eyes that didn't just see. They measured. Every footstep, every tremor in the hand, every whispered secret exchanged under the weight of guilt. She studied human beings as if they were equations waiting to be solved. And then, she began speaking the unspeakable, naming the hour when a man would die, reciting the private sins of husbands and wives who thought no one had seen, describing crimes hidden beneath Milwaukee's cobblestones with such terrifying accuracy that even priests avoided her gaze. She wasn't just a child with gifts. She was a mirror, a calculation machine for truth, stripping away the fragile lies men had built to protect their reputations, their marriages, their lives. And in just a few months, her words would kill 3 men, destroy a family, and make her vanish forever. The record books never told you why she disappeared. They don't print the truth because the truth is dangerous. What Emma uncovered wasn't just local gossip. It was a web of corruption, betrayal, and blood that had festered beneath Milwaukee's German quarter for years. And here's the question you need to ask yourself right now. Was Emma Richter a prodigy beyond science? Or was she something science has deliberately erased from history? Imagine the year 1873. Milwaukee's German quarter was alive with the sound of clattering wagons, brewery whistles, and the laughter of men who drowned their exhaustion in beer after long shifts in the heat of copper kettles. To outsiders, it was an industrious, vibrant community. Red brick breweries rising like temples, beer gardens alive with song, and families huddled close in their modest wooden homes. But behind the curtains of those homes were the same sins and secrets that have haunted humanity since the beginning. Infidelity, theft, betrayal, hidden debts, grudges that festered like wounds. And into this world was born Emma Richter, a pale slip of a girl with eyes the color of storm clouds, who absorbed it all in silence. From the moment she could walk, Emma had a habit that unsettled her parents. She counted everything, the stitches in her mother's embroidery, the seconds between the whistles that marked brewery shifts, the steps between the bakery and the church. At first, it seemed harmless, an odd child's quirk. But as she grew, her counting transformed into something far more precise, almost predatory. She began not just to count, but to compare, to map, to recognize patterns in ways adults could not. By age 4, she could repeat entire conversations she had overheard days earlier, every inflection perfect, every pause identical. By age 6, she solved arithmetic in her head faster than her father could scribble numbers on paper. Her neighbors noticed. Some smiled with pride. Others crossed themselves in fear. An old woman muttered that Emma's stare reminded her of the witches her grandmother had spoken of, the ones who could see straight through a man's soul. The parish priest, Father Collar, at first praised her as a sign of divine blessing. But the blessing was a mask. Because when the winter of 1872 struck, so brutally cold that Lake Michigan froze solid, Emma began to reveal something no one was prepared for. From her small kitchen window, she sat like a sentinel, watching. She noticed that Mr. Kruger walked 247 steps to the brewery each morning, except Wednesdays when he took a longer route, 284 steps. She saw that Mrs. Fisher hung her laundry in a strict order, except when her husband stayed late at the mill, when the sequence changed entirely. Emma wasn't just observing. She was calculating. She was decoding the algorithm of human life itself. And then, one morning in February 1873, she broke the silence. She looked up from her porridge and calmly told her mother the exact hour a man in the neighborhood would die. And when the clock struck that moment, he did. That was the beginning of fear, the beginning of whispers, the beginning of a darkness that Milwaukee's German quarter would never escape. The death of Johann Dietrich should have been written off as coincidence. After all, brewery workers died often. Overwork, alcohol, accidents in the malt rooms where heavy sacks crushed weaker men. But it wasn't the death itself that froze the blood of the German quarter. It was Emma's precision. She had named the man. She had named the hour. She had warned her mother, in that calm, detached tone, as if she were reading an equation off a chalkboard. And when the clock struck 14 minutes past 2, and Dietrich fell lifeless to the brewery floor, every whisper of laughter in the taverns died in their throats. They began to watch Emma as she had watched them. Her parents begged her to keep silent, but she did not. Within weeks, her words became sharper, heavier, as if she herself was compelled to speak. One evening, she sat in church with her family, eyes fixed on the polished floorboards. When Father Collar lifted the host and intoned the words of consecration, Emma turned to the woman kneeling beside her and said in a voice that carried through the entire nave, "You should not pray for forgiveness for the child you buried under the linden tree. He will not hear you." The woman gasped and fainted before the altar, her veil slipping to the floor. The parishioners scattered in panic, crossing themselves, murmuring Teufelkind, devil child. Only later would the truth emerge. Years before, that woman had concealed a pregnancy, a child born dead, hidden in the night. No one living had ever spoken of it. No one except Emma. After that night, her eyes became unbearable to meet. She no longer merely repeated patterns or counted steps. She unearthed what people thought unseeable. Debts hidden in ledgers, letters burned in the stove, the precise words a husband whispered to another woman's ear. Her tongue was a scalpel, and with it she cut through every veil of secrecy the quarter had wrapped itself in. The respectable facade of Milwaukee's Bavarian enclave. Its church, its breweries, its tidy homes, began to collapse under the weight of exposure. Marriages faltered. Business partners accused each other of betrayal. And Emma sat silently at her window, unblinking, as if watching it all with cold satisfaction. But there was a darker layer still. She was not merely echoing the sins of the living. She began to speak of events no one could have seen. Crimes committed in locked rooms. Betrayals sealed with blood years before her birth. And when she spoke, the guilty felt as if they had been dragged naked before judgment. The community began to ask the question none dared voice aloud. How could she know? At first, people tried to reason it away. Perhaps Emma was simply observant. Perhaps she overheard confessions whispered too loudly, or caught stray words through thin walls. That would have been explainable. That would have been safe. But what Emma revealed in the spring of 1873 no longer belonged to the realm of human observation. It belonged to something older, stranger, and infinitely more dangerous. She began speaking of things she could not possibly have witnessed. She described a man's secret rendezvous with his mistress in a brewery storeroom. Details so exact that when the workers searched, they found her scarf still wedged behind the barrels. She named the spot where a child's body had been buried years before, under a linden tree on the outskirts of the settlement, and when men dug with trembling hands, they unearthed bones wrapped in the rotted fabric of an infant's gown. And then there were her recitations, words spoken in locked rooms years earlier, conversations long forgotten. Emma would repeat them word for word, even imitating the accents of the men who had spoken. And when she did, their faces went pale, because the words were not just accurate. They were damning. Men began to avoid walking past her home. Mothers pulled their children inside when they saw her figure at the window. And yet, no matter how they tried to turn away, Emma's voice followed them. At market, she would brush against someone's sleeve and whisper, Your brother still bleeds from the wound you gave him. He waits for you. At church, she would murmur to a woman kneeling in prayer. You pray too loudly. God heard you the first time, and he does not forgive you. These were not observations. These were revelations. The question was no longer how much she knew, but where the knowledge came from. Was she touched by God, as some still desperately insisted? Was she possessed by the devil, as others swore in fearful tones? Or was there something colder, something mathematical at work? An intelligence that reduced human life to patterns, algorithms, sequences too intricate for ordinary minds to trace? Her father once demanded an answer. Emma, he said, trembling, how do you know these things? She looked at him with her storm-gray eyes and said only, because the numbers tell me. They never lie. People lie, father. But numbers, they whisper everything. And so the German quarter realized they were not simply being watched. They were being measured, calculated, reduced to data in the mind of a child who seemed less human with every passing day. By March of 1873, the quarter no longer saw Emma Richter as a child. She had become an omen, a living equation that could not be escaped. It began with Dietrich's death, but soon her calculations expanded beyond the personal sins of her neighbors. She began predicting events. Not rumors, not gossip, catastrophes, mapped out with surgical precision. On a gray morning, as her mother kneaded bread, Emma stopped counting the turns of the dough and announced, the brewery roof will collapse before nightfall. 3 men will not rise again. Greta scolded her sharply for such morbid talk. But before dusk, as a storm pressed down on Milwaukee, the sodden beams of the Kellner brewery gave way. 3 men were crushed under tons of debris, exactly as Emma had foretold. Whispers became fear. Fear hardened into terror. And yet Emma's proclamations did not stop. She warned a woman in the market that her infant would drown if left unattended. Hours later, the child slipped into a washtub and was pulled out lifeless. She told an elderly brewer that his heart would give out at Sunday Mass. He laughed, slapped her on the head, and died gasping for air at the altar, his rosary clattering across the floor. What chilled people most was not just her accuracy, but her reasoning. She spoke as though death itself were a pattern she had solved, a formula only she could see. His breath is shorter with every step, she explained. The timber has shifted by 9 degrees. The child's mother looks away for 17 seconds too long. She delivered these explanations in the same cold, methodical tone she used to count stitches in a cloth. The men of the quarter began drinking harder, some out of despair, others to drown out the ticking clock they felt Emma had placed over their heads. Wives prayed more fervently, clutching their children as if Emma's gray eyes might mark them next. And the priest, who once declared Emma a blessing, now spoke of Satan twisting innocence into an instrument of ruin. But the people had seen too much to trust either holy words or rational denial. Emma Richter was not a fortune-teller. She was not a seer. She was an executioner of inevitability, a mirror to a truth no man wanted revealed, that their lives were fragile equations, waiting to be solved and ended. And the worst part? Emma was only just beginning to speak. By late spring, Emma Richter's gaze no longer fell on individuals alone. It widened, like a lantern sweeping across the hidden architecture of Milwaukee's German quarter. What she began to reveal was not mere personal shame. It was the machinery of corruption itself, the very networks of power that bound the community together. First, her words seemed innocent enough. She asked her father why her Kleiner, a wealthy brewer, always carried a leather book in his coat pocket but never opened it in public. Weeks later, during a dispute between workers and management, Emma recited entire pages of figures from that very book. Numbers of debts owed, secret bribes, wages stolen. When Kleiner raged that it was impossible, that the book never left his side, the men cornered him and demanded answers. They found the entries exactly as Emma described. His fortune was built on theft. The dam had cracked, and once Emma had loosened it, the flood could not be stopped. She told a widow at market that her husband had not died in an accident, as the brewery claimed. He had been struck deliberately, pushed beneath a collapsing stack of barrels during a labor dispute. She named the man who had shoved him, and when confronted, his guilt was written plainly in his terror. She whispered to her mother that Father Collar had been meeting privately with men at the edge of the cemetery, long after midnight. Days later, half the parish knew of these clandestine gatherings. And when they investigated, they discovered money changing hands, protection bought in silence. Emma was no longer just a pale girl at a window. She had become a threat to the very foundation of the quarter's power. Men who had grown wealthy from laborers' blood began to fear her words more than the law itself. Priests who preached of God's order found themselves trembling when she sat in their pews. She did not accuse with fury, nor expose with malice. She simply stated facts, as if she were reading them from the air itself. The quarter began to divide. Some believed Emma was chosen to cleanse their community, a divine instrument cutting rot from the bone. Others whispered she was a weapon of the devil, sent to dismantle their lives brick by brick. But whether divine or damned, one truth was undeniable. Secrets could no longer survive in her presence. And the powerful knew with a kind of animal certainty that if Emma continued, she would destroy them all. Fear makes men irrational, but fear of exposure makes them dangerous. By the summer of 1873, Emma Richter was no longer simply a curiosity or even a menace. She was a liability to every powerful man in Milwaukee's German quarter. Her words had already dismantled reputations, collapsed alliances, and stirred suspicion in places where silence once ruled. And so the quarter began to respond the way men always do when cornered, with retaliation. It started subtly. Neighbors who once greeted the Richters with polite nods now crossed the street to avoid them. Children were pulled away from Emma's path, as if proximity to her pale figure might infect them. Greta, her mother, discovered bread left at their door laced with powdered glass. Hinrich's wages were cut without explanation. Rumors whispered that he was hiding a witch under his roof. The family's isolation was not by choice, it was engineered. But isolation was not enough. The men whose secrets Emma had unearthed, wealthy brewers, landowners, even church leaders, began to speak in hushed tones of solutions. Solutions that would end the problem permanently. Father Collar, once Emma's defender, was now heard advising Hinrich to send her away, for the safety of all. The implication was clear. If the Richters did not remove their daughter, others would. And yet Emma did not cower. If anything, her voice grew sharper, colder, more deliberate. One evening, as her father sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, Emma said, "They will try to silence me, but they forget that silence does not erase numbers. Numbers echo. They always return." The retaliation escalated. A stone shattered their window in the night. A shadow lingered too long outside their door. Hinrich, once a respected brewmaster, was cornered by two men in an alley and warned that if his daughter spoke again of debts or deaths, she would not live to see another Sunday. And still Emma watched, calculated, unafraid. It was then that the true terror set in. Because the more they tried to suppress her, the more precise her revelations became. It was as though the threat itself sharpened her mind. She began naming not just sins but the plans of her enemies, exposing their conspiracies before they could act. And with each prediction, their hatred of her grew. Emma Richter was no longer a child in their eyes. She was a threat to the entire structure of power. And in Milwaukee's German quarter, threats were not tolerated. They were eliminated. The breaking point came on a sweltering night in July, when the air itself seemed to thicken with unease. The men who had gathered in secret, brewers, merchants, even a magistrate, sat in the back room of a tavern, smoke curling above their heads as they argued over what to do about the pale girl with storm-colored eyes. They spoke in low, urgent tones, certain that their conspiracy was sealed by the heavy oak door. But Emma had already marked them. The following Sunday, as bells tolled for Mass, Emma entered the church beside her parents. She walked down the aisle with that same unnerving calm, her gaze fixed not on the altar, but on the men who had plotted her erasure. When she reached the pew, she stopped, turned, and spoke. Not in a shout, not in hysteria, but in a voice steady enough to cut through the silence of the sanctuary. 9 men gathered on Thursday. 8 cigars were smoked, 3 whiskeys poured. The magistrate left first. The others stayed until the second bell after midnight. You spoke of my death. You agreed that it was necessary. The church froze, faces drained of color. Wives turned to husbands with horror. And Emma went on, detailing the exact words each man had spoken, who had suggested poison, who had urged drowning, who had muttered that accidents happen easily in breweries. Her precision was merciless. Each syllable fell like a hammer against their reputations. By the time she finished, the congregation was in chaos. Some rushed from the church, unwilling to hear more. Others glared at the accused, whispers rising like a storm. And the 9 men, those pillars of the community, sat exposed, their secrets stripped bare in front of God and neighbor alike. That was the moment the quarter understood. Emma could not be silenced by whispers, nor cornered by shadows. She was always 2 steps ahead, as though she could see their plots before they left the tongue. And in that realization came something far darker, rage. The men no longer saw Emma as a child. She had humiliated them before their wives, their workers, their God. She had broken the fragile machinery of power that kept their world intact. In their eyes, she had crossed a line from dangerous curiosity to existential threat. And threats are not tolerated. They are destroyed. What followed was not a question of if the quarter would strike back, but when. After that Sunday, Milwaukee's German quarter was never the same. Fear no longer whispered in corners. It screamed in every tavern, echoed in every market, poisoned every glance. The 9 men Emma had exposed sat like condemned prisoners, unable to speak without suspicion snapping at their heels. And the community, once proud and close-knit, dissolved into paranoia. Neighbors spied on neighbors. Husbands accused wives. Wives accused husbands. Every pattern, every deviation, every shadow in the street became a sign that the pale girl was watching. Then the deaths began. First was Herr Albrecht, one of the men who had sat in that smoke-filled tavern. He was found face down in the river, his pockets heavy with stones. The coroner called it suicide, but no one believed it. The second was Otto Klein, a foreman at the Kellner Brewery. A beam came loose, crushing him beneath a mountain of splintered wood. Workers swore they had seen the timber braced hours before. And then there was Lucas Braun, a merchant, who collapsed suddenly at his desk, his eyes wide with terror, his heart bursting like an overripe fruit. 3 deaths. 3 men who had spoken against Emma. The quarter began to whisper again, but now in tones of dread. Was Emma not merely predicting death, but causing it? Was she a messenger of judgment, or judgment itself? The more they speculated, the more her silence unnerved them. She did not boast, did not defend herself, did not weep. She sat at her window as always, her gray eyes calculating, as though tallying the bodies that would fall next. Fathers refused to let their sons walk past Galena Street. Women crossed themselves when they saw her. Some claimed she was not even human, that she had been born of the sea crossing, a changeling who carried with her the curse of every drowned soul lost in the Atlantic. Others swore she was a prophet, sent to tear away the masks of corruption before fire cleansed the quarter. But beneath these stories was the same gnawing truth. Emma Richter had become something larger than a child. She was an event, a force, and the more men tried to resist her, the more the violence spread. The German quarter no longer trusted its priests, its brewers, or even its own families. Trust had become impossible, because Emma had proven the one truth that destroys all communities. Secrets never stay buried, and when the guilty began to die, one by one, the innocent began to wonder. Would her gaze fall on them next? By autumn of 1873, the quarter was a tinderbox of dread. Every man who had opposed Emma felt marked, waiting for the blade to fall. Some drank themselves into stupors, hoping not to wake. Others fled Milwaukee entirely, abandoning businesses, leaving wives to explain empty chairs at supper. But the pressure on the Richter family was unbearable. Hinrich, once a proud brewmaster, had grown hollow-eyed, his hands trembling as he lifted each mug. The other men no longer greeted him as a peer, they treated him as the father of a curse. Greta rarely left the house, her once nimble hands raw from scrubbing already clean floors, as if she could wash away the whispers that clung to her family. And Emma? She seemed untouched, as if none of it concerned her. She continued her vigil at the window, numbers pouring through her mind like tides no one else could see. The threats grew bolder. A dead crow nailed to their door, a knife mark carved across their threshold. One night, Heinrich woke to find smoke curling under the bedroom door. Someone had tried to set the house alight while the family slept. They survived only because Emma, sitting awake by the window as always, saw the glow of the flame and spoke her father's name in time. By now, Emma's voice had changed. It was no longer the chatter of a precocious child, but something colder, older. She spoke less often, but when she did, her words fell with the finality of judgment. One night she told her mother, "They cannot remove me. If they cut out the tongue, the numbers still speak. If they break the body, the pattern remains. Do not be afraid." Greta wept, not from comfort but from terror. And then she was gone. One morning in November, Heinrich rose to find the kitchen empty. The chair by the window stood vacant, her small shoes neatly placed beside it. The door was locked from within, the shutters bolted, no footprints in the frost outside. It was as if Emma had dissolved into the night itself. She left behind only a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with endless numbers, symbols, and strange calculations no one dared to decode. The family was shattered. Heinrich left the brewery and vanished into obscurity. Greta wasted away, speaking Emma's name until her voice broke. And the quarter, though relieved, was not free, because Emma had disappeared without a trace, but her absence felt more dangerous than her presence. The girl science could not explain had become a legend, and legends never stay buried. The journal was not meant to be read, and yet it called to those who feared it most. Bound in worn leather, its spine cracked from use, the pages bore no stories, no prayers, no diary of a child's life. Instead, there were numbers, columns and rows, equations without answers, calculations that wound back upon themselves like serpents eating their tails. The handwriting was steady, neat, as though Emma had written not for herself but for someone else to follow. At first, Heinrich tried to burn it. He set it on the stove, but the flame refused to catch, the ink gleaming wet as if freshly written. He hurled it into the river, but by dawn it was back on the kitchen table, damp but intact. It was Greta who finally whispered, "It cannot be destroyed, it must be read." And so the whisper spread. A brewer's apprentice claimed to have seen in its pages the exact tally of debts his master owed, figures no child could have known. A widow swore it held the day and hour of her husband's death, written weeks before it happened. By winter, the journal was no longer merely an object. It was an infection. Those who looked upon its pages could not look away. The patterns began to bleed into the minds of its readers. Men who once prided themselves on reason found themselves scribbling strings of numbers on walls and workbenches, muttering of debts that could never be repaid. A magistrate, one of the 9 Emma had exposed, locked himself in his study for 3 days with the book. On the 4th, he was found hanging from the rafters, his final note nothing but the digits Emma had scrawled over and over again. The journal passed from hand to hand, never openly, always in secret. Those who touched it seemed marked, pale, distracted, muttering in half-formed equations. And always, there was the dread that Emma herself lingered between its pages, watching, tallying, waiting. Some said the book was unfinished, that Emma had disappeared because she was not yet done writing. That one day, when the last number was inscribed, the pattern would close, and whatever force she had channeled would reveal itself in full. Others whispered that it already contained the names of every man, woman, and child in the quarter, their fates calculated to the last breath. By 1874, the Richters' home stood abandoned. But the journal did not vanish with them. It remained, passed through hidden channels, each new owner more paranoid, more broken than the last. It was not a book anymore. It was a curse, one that ensured Emma Richter's absence was far louder than her presence had ever been. The German quarter had thought itself rid of Emma Richter when she vanished, but the journal ensured she was never truly gone. What began as a local affliction, a cursed book passed between trembling hands in Milwaukee, soon spread beyond the quarter's narrow streets. By 1875, the journal had slipped its boundaries, carried by merchants, travelers, and those who believed they could harness its dark arithmetic. The first whispers reached Chicago. A railway clerk, newly arrived from Milwaukee, was said to have shown his colleagues a strange book that predicted derailments with uncanny accuracy. Within weeks, the clerk was found dead on the tracks, his body broken, the journal gone. In St. Louis, a banker received a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was Emma's book, now heavier, thicker, as if new pages had been added by unseen hands. He too fell into obsession, locking himself away at night, scribbling calculations that mapped not money but mortality. His fortune dissolved in weeks, his wife fleeing in terror. Wherever it surfaced, ruin followed. Rumors thickened that the journal no longer contained just Emma's numbers, but the fevered scrawl of every man who had tried to master it. Whole sections were said to be written in different hands, cursive, blocky, frantic, layered over Emma's neat columns, as if each new owner had contributed unwillingly to the growing manuscript. By the late 1870s, it had become legend among German immigrant communities across the Midwest. Parents warned their children not to speak of it. Priests denounced it from the pulpit, calling it Das Flutschbuch, the cursed book. But denunciation only deepened its allure. In Cincinnati, dockworkers swore one of their own carried the book, and that the deaths along the riverfront, 3 drownings in a single month, were written in its pages beforehand. In Pittsburgh, it was whispered that a steel magnate had consulted the book for labor strikes, only to find his own name etched in the margins. The most chilling rumor of all was that the book had begun to replicate itself. That copies, faithful in content, identical down to the ink blotches, appeared where none had been before. A minister in Cleveland claimed he woke to find one on his bedside table, though he had never laid eyes on the original. A family in Kansas swore their child brought home a tattered notebook she found in a field, filled with Emma's patterns in her hand. Emma Richter, the pale girl of Milwaukee, had dissolved into myth. Yet through the journal, she persisted. Her voice transmuted into numbers, her gaze carried through ink. The quarter had wanted her erased. Instead, it had birthed something indestructible. And as the book traveled farther, the question became not where it would appear next, but who it would choose. By the 1880s, Emma Richter's story had escaped the confines of Milwaukee's German quarter and seeped into the bloodstream of the nation itself. What began as immigrant whispers had become a contagion of hysteria, fueled by newspapers hungry for sensation and a public increasingly obsessed with the occult, mesmerism, and the hidden mechanics of the mind. America, still reeling from civil war and rapid industrial upheaval, was fertile ground for a tale like Emma's, a pale child who could see through the skin of reality. In New York, a journalist for the Herald printed a serialized exposé titled The Wisconsin Oracle, a child who defied death. He claimed to have interviewed sources who handled the journal, though skeptics noted his description seemed lifted from earlier Milwaukee reports. Still, circulation soared. Competing papers across the country reprinted the story, each embellishing further. Emma had predicted assassinations, bank failures, floods. Soon, she wasn't just a girl from Milwaukee. She was a phantom mathematician haunting the entire republic. Spiritualist circles, already holding seances in every major city, seized on the legend. Mediums claimed Emma whispered through their tables, reciting patterns of numbers no one understood. One group in Boston declared the journal a holy relic, proof of contact with the unseen world. A rival sect in Philadelphia went further. They called Emma not a saint but a vessel of demonic calculation, a warning that numbers themselves could be an infernal language. Both groups attracted followers. Both drew money. Both left behind broken men who lost themselves in decoding impossible formulas. The panic wasn't contained to the fringes. State legislatures debated laws against mathematical prophecy. Priests thundered against Richterism, branding it a heresy. Yet the louder the condemnation, the deeper the fascination. Pamphlets were sold in railway stations with titles like The Girl Who Knew Too Much and The Milwaukee Enigma. Traveling lecturers filled halls with audiences desperate to hear how a child could unravel hidden patterns that bound life to death. And beneath the spectacle lurked something darker: the violence. In Detroit, a man shot his neighbor, claiming Emma's numbers in the journal proved the neighbor meant to poison him. In Baltimore, police found a mother and her 2 children dead in a locked room, Emma's name scrawled on the walls in chalk equations. Each act was dismissed as madness, but the contagion was clear. The idea of Emma Richter had become a weapon, an invisible trigger in the American mind. By the close of the decade, the hysteria had carved a place in national mythology. To some, she was an unholy prophet. To others, a fraud. But to the growing number of men who whispered of her in private, Emma was something else entirely. A key. A doorway. Proof that beneath the chaos of human life there lay a lattice of patterns. And if one could see them clearly enough, he could control everything. And that belief, that hunger, was far more dangerous than any child. By the dawn of the 1890s, Emma Richter was no longer just a ghost story for children or a scandalous headline in the papers. Her name had been absorbed into the bloodstream of America's hidden orders. The hysteria of the public gave way to something colder, more deliberate. Powerful men, men who already trafficked in secrecy and influence, began to see in Emma's journal not a curse, but a map. In New York, within the smoke-filled rooms of Tammany Hall, whispers spread of a ledger that could anticipate betrayals before they happened. In Washington, senators traded rumors of a Richter cipher, said to predict the outcomes of close elections with unsettling precision. And in Chicago, as the city rebuilt itself from the ashes of the Great Fire, businessmen were said to have gathered in shuttered parlors, charting Emma's equations against railroad schedules, grain shipments, and stock prices. Some laughed, others grew pale. None dismissed it outright. What had been dismissed as immigrant superstition was now a tool for those with ambition. The journal, or copies of it, if such things could be believed, was no longer treated as a cursed object, but as a forbidden manual. Its patterns of death became patterns of opportunity. Its cold arithmetic of human behavior was sharpened into an instrument of control. And men who once wielded only money or law now sought to wield inevitability itself. This was the true transformation. Emma Richter, the fragile child who vanished from Milwaukee, became the patron saint of calculation. Not the innocent prodigy of folklore, not the demon child of pulp novels, but the silent mentor of a new kind of power. A power rooted not in brute force or divine blessing, but in the recognition that human beings, families, workers, whole communities, moved according to patterns, as predictable as the orbit of a star. Secret societies grew fat on this revelation. Orders of lawyers, bankers, and industrialists began incorporating Emma's numbers into their initiation rites. They told themselves it was symbolic, but symbols shape minds and minds shape empires. In candlelit rooms, young men recited her sequences aloud, binding themselves to the logic of inevitability. They called it enlightenment, but it was servitude, the surrender of freedom to pattern. And here is where the line blurs, my friend. Was Emma a girl cursed with sight? Or was she the vessel through which something older, colder, and far more calculating revealed itself to mankind? By the century's end, Emma Richter was no longer a missing child. She was an algorithm wrapped in myth, a weaponized ghost. And those who touched her numbers did not simply vanish. They transformed. And now you must face the truth that cannot be contained by the past. Emma Richter is not just a fragment of 1873, not just a pale child who whispered numbers into the frozen air of Milwaukee. She is here. She never left. Her patterns did not die with her disappearance. They evolved. They were adopted. They became the very architecture of the age you live in. Think about it, what was Emma doing but predicting human behavior with precision? Counting steps, noticing changes in rhythm, calculating inevitabilities. Today, entire empires are built on this. Algorithms trace your movements, predict your purchases, your desires, your fears. They calculate when you will wake, what you will click, how long you will linger before you move on. Emma's gaze has become the invisible gaze of the machine, measuring you in ways she once measured her neighbors. The journal did not vanish. It metastasized. It is in the credit scores that decide your worth. It is in the targeted messages that arrive before you even know what you want. It is in the quiet manipulation of elections, in the prediction of riots before they erupt, in the quiet nudges that guide billions of people into cages of behavior they mistake for choice. The same cold precision that frightened Milwaukee has been scaled into a global lattice. The pattern is everywhere now, and you are living inside it. This is the descent Emma began. A descent into a world where free will is an illusion, where your steps are counted before you take them, where your death itself might be a calculation waiting in someone's hidden ledger. The German quarter's whispers have become the roar of modern systems, and the men who once trembled before Emma's journal now build careers and kingdoms by carrying her curse forward. And so, I ask you, if you have come this far, if you have stared into Emma Richter's abyss and felt something staring back, declare yourself. In the comments below, write the phrase, "I see the pattern," not once, but twice. Do this not for the algorithm, but to mark the moment you stop being a passive listener and become something more. A man awakened to the design, a man who knows that the journal never ended, and that its pages are still being written. But remember this. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. You carry the weight Emma carried. You become the watcher and the watched. And from here on, every step you take, every choice you make, may already be written in the numbers. Welcome to the final descent. Before you go, ask yourself this. If an 11-year-old girl in 1873 could see the invisible lattice of your life, what makes you think the systems of today cannot? The journal did not die with Emma Richter. It simply changed form. And if you've watched this far, you've already touched its pages. So here's what I want you to do. Prove to yourself that you are awake, not just another predictable number. In the comments, write, "I see the pattern" twice. Not once, twice. That is the moment of transformation, the mark of one who has crossed the threshold. And if you dare go deeper, subscribe, because what comes next is not entertainment. It is initiation. Every story I bring you is another fracture in the illusion, another descent into the truths buried beneath history's polite lies. You will not leave the same. So take a breath. Look around you. Ask yourself, whose journal are you living in? And then step forward.